Uh, May I now invite Professor Danial Rycroft to share his thoughts with us. Over to you, Professor Danial Rycroft.
Inspiring company. I really wanted to reflect on two ASRs, if I may. One is, of course, academic social responsibility, and the other is Adivasi self-rule. Before I do that, and my comments are going to be fairly brief, I wanted to reflect on some of the themes that I think are going to be important as we move forward on all of these important trajectories. One is the sense in which collectively we can also absorb lessons from the past. Whilst academic social responsibility may be a relatively recently coined phrase, it has actually been in existence under different auspices for a long time. And I think, ever since in the Indian context, decolonization began, which of course invokes a history longer than a post-partition and post-independence history, there has been efforts towards the kind of thought processes and actually fairly practical activities that are under discussion today. So I think one important sort of point to make then is that, yes, we are continually moving through a very long, sometimes seemingly slow process of decolonization, but to find ways to manage the different levels, the different aspirations in a sustainable and properly transformative way. I have some ideas as to how that can persist into the future. And I think at the center of those ideas is the prospect that higher education needs to take a much more active and a much more dynamic and joined up role, precisely in the terms outlined at the beginning of the session, to give us the knowledge, the understanding, the connection, the context for this, so that our future generations do not feel ignored. Okay, so ASR, on the one hand, can mean academic social responsibility, and it can also mean to some people Adivasi self-rule. And why I invoke that concept is because it is, to my mind, an undernourished and lesser known concept. So it's then also building together a framework of thoughts, consciousness, communications, aspirations, identities that are all seemingly under the auspices of the micro. Certainly when it comes to India's context, there has been, either to a greater or lesser extent, an exclusion of Adivasi storytelling, Adivasi knowledge creation, Adivasi education in the so-called mainstream. Adivasi self-rule is, of course, a contentious concept. I'm not referring to it as a form of territorial secession from any other polity. I'm talking about it in terms of the right for India's Adivasis to be in charge of their own destiny when it comes to their own political participation, their own education, and so forth. And of course that is a bit of a polemic, but it's a polemic that I think merits all of our attention, because we can respond to that particular claim for higher levels of autonomy and respect and recognition from wherever we are. And we can orientate towards that, I would argue, in a more joined up way. So I'm seeing this particular project as an opportunity to understand why earlier thinkers like Sabyasachi, for example, factored in this concept of Adivasi self-rule into their concept of citizenship at large in the Indian context. Like Sabyasachi, this recent book, Humanities in India, talks about the cultural heritage of India's Adivasis in a way that absorb not only Adivasi traditions and Adivasi knowledge into play, but also non-Adivasi and non-Adivasi non-Adivasi traditions and non-Adivasi knowledge, in a way that establishes some kind of room for, or space for dialogue and mutual understanding, and also mutual transformation in a way that's more geared towards Adivasi empowerment. So I started to kind of think much more about what it means to be non-Adivasi, not in the straightforward sense of not being Adivasi, but in the more complex arena of being, if you like, pro-Adivasi, familiar with the issues that are raised when one takes seriously Adivasi humanity and Adivasi power. So some of my thinking on that, well, quite a lot of it actually, especially in my earlier academic career, stemmed from the subaltern studies interventions. And I think a lot of what is happening here is actually a really important shift towards almost like a return to that ethos, but in a way that has a much more socialized texture. And that's really where and how and why we're moving across to the other ASR, which is of course academic social responsibility. I just wanted to share a few words around that, because we're also talking about here university social responsibility, and I wanted just to make some clarifications on to what might constitute some of the differentiations. So to my mind, they are slightly different in scale and slightly different in terms of how the social responsibility actually pertains. So on the one hand, if we're talking about the social responsibility of academia, it's very much inclusive of academics. It's inclusive of teachers and learners. It's in fact inclusive of anybody and everybody whose, in a sense, participation is premised on higher education. And so that gives us all, of course, an entry point into that space. And I think the more that we can cultivate kind of a clear sense of what ASR is for us, the more productive the conversations will be as and when we return to them under the auspices of ASR. More specifically, in terms of my experience, John's experience, and so forth, we're coming at this from a humanities perspective, but that's not exclusively so. We might also want to work very closely, for example, with social scientists. We come at it, yes, with some kind of disciplinary perspective, but not exclusively so. So we're working much more towards ideas of pluralism, interdisciplinarity, almost like post-disciplinarity, I would suggest, towards the generation of an ecology which is much better able to engage these intellectual traditions and expressions that are under consideration in this project. And so that's where I think we come to university with social responsibility, because the university is the context within which knowledge becomes transmissible. It becomes, in a sense, valued in a certain way beyond just individual people. We're thinking of course, the future classroom, what it means to learn in spaces that aren't necessarily just kind of codified by what is perhaps a conventional sense of academia. But I think we're moving into a space that's now much more, we're wanting it in fact to be much more connected with perhaps less formal teaching and learning spaces, and somehow then to disrupt the hierarchies of value that mark one off from the other. Now, to get to that point, we're going to, I think, have to think a long way ahead to a context where social stakeholders, social participants, the people who are perhaps on the margins, so to speak, have it in their interest as well to participate in a way that fully regards them just as we would want our own interests to be regarded. By that I mean, like, what's the longer term role for these knowledge holders in this, you could say, kind of people's university, to put it in perhaps rather sort of crude terms. Now, that's, I think, all I really wanted to say. I think there are a lot of challenges ahead, also some great opportunities. So let's move forward together and with required levels of cultural, linguistic, intellectual and philosophical diversity. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rycroft. Professor Rycroft has very importantly conceptualized the idea of the People's University, how we can bring the outside into the teaching machine, to borrow from Gayatri's pre-work. So, to talk about the Adivasi, their ways of storytelling, their intellectual traditions, etc., so that there is no more, the binary, or at least there is an attempt to overcome the binaries and inequalities existing in society. So thank you, and I think that is very much in line with what we are trying to do here.